So this is SECAR. This is actually a device that I don't know if you'll see it in the tour tomorrow. Probably not. This is a device that basically you tune it to transmit all recalls or a reaction that happens. So you send a beam of some characteristics, and you have all of these magnets that want to separate that beam that you transmit from the reaction that happens. You actually only want to have the recall. The recall is what is producing the reaction, okay? If you have no idea what a nuclear reaction. This is very hard to do because most of these cross sections, the probability of a reaction happening here is very, very small. If we are lucky, it's 1 in a billion cases, if you are lucky. So we basically have to separate 1 billion particles that do not interact with our target from that one particle that interacted, that became a recall. It's very, very hard to do. So in that way, we have to tune all of these magnets in such a way that that happens. So we have dipoles. Dipoles bend the beam. We have quadruples. Quadruples is like a lens that you can focus or defocus the beam. We have some high order magnets that I don't want to describe here. And then we have something called velocity filters that is basically separates things that have different velocity. For the purpose of the exercise that I want you to do, this is what you need to know. The first thing is that this is the reaction that we have in the activity. This is arsenic 75 going to a proton target producing a selenium-66. Okay, so black is arsenic 65, yellow, white is selenium-66. Most of the time, this doesn't happen. Most of the time, what happens is that you have the beam that goes to unreacted beam, and then we have a recall that is in white. Because this is the section that has two dipoles, basically it separates by the ratio of mass over charge. The masses in this case are relatively similar, 65 and 66. That's close enough. But the charge changes a little bit more. So basically it separates by charge. So that's why we call it charge selection. That's one important thing that you have to remember, if you don't remember anything else. And the rest of the thing that SECAR does, at least up to here, is that because you have different velocities here for the selenium and the arsenic, you basically separate by mass. Okay, that's the only thing that we need to know about SECAR. Now, if you look at the envelope of this beam that goes through the system, this is what you will see. And this is actually part of the exercise that you see in the code. This is the recall, in this case, the selenium-66 is shown here in gray. Okay, this is the horizontal beam size of all those recalls that may be produced as a function of distance from the start of the target, from basically from here. The distance from here all the way up to here. Okay. This envelope depends on the final velocity that the system has, the final angle that the system has, and what charge it has, and all of that. The thing is that there are two selection points. Here, what you describe it when you select the charge, and here when you select the mass. What you really want to do is to separate this black thing. This black thing is the unreacted selenium-66. This is for every one of these gray lines, there is a billion of these black lines. So it's very hard to separate. So one of the things that we do in SECAR, if a recall separator works properly, is that we actually put slits here to basically block the beam here. So with slits, block this one and only transmit this. So one of the things that we want to optimize using emulators, for example, is how we set the optics of these recalls in such a way that, for example, here, the ratio of the distance between this point and this point divided by the distance of this is maximized. Or actually, it's the inverted resolution. The resolution is you want to have this as small as possible and this as far away as possible to basically to obtain a good resolution. So that's one thing that you want to optimize. The other thing is that here in the charge selection, you also want to have a very narrow beam spot. And you want to have a very narrow beam spot because you want to separate the different charges that are produced going through the target. Now, as you can see here, actually, these are very bad optics. It's very bad optics because the beam spot here, this is the solid line here, is not a narrow point. And that is because I waited until yesterday to do this hands-on activity. So when I was preparing these slides, I realized that when the actual optics that we have in SECAR were produced with a way more sophisticated code that gave me the right optics. But for this purpose, when I was coding this yesterday, I could only do this to first degree, to first order, and it turns out that the optics that I had do not work very well. So I had to find the optics by hand very quickly. And this was the best case that I could find. So your job is actually to do better than me, okay? Now, if you're interested, SECAR has been optimized using emulators for different things. Like this is one of the examples. This is an example. The beam that goes into SECAR has to be very, very well aligned. We have published a paper on that, and this is a reference if you're interested. What we're actually trying to do is a part of this. I described two of the things that I want you all to optimize. The resolution at what we call focal plane 2, and the width at focal plane 1. If you are brave enough, there are more things that you can try to optimize in different places, okay? Now, the emulator that we selected for this exercise is basically a Gaussian process. It's a Bayesian optimization where you have a model that is a Gaussian process, an acquisition function that tells you where you're trying to sample the points. I mean, this is a large dimensional phase space. In this case, for this exercise, what you're trying to optimize is the settings for 7 quadruples. Depending on how you set those quadruples, this beam envelope changes. It goes up or down, okay? So that's why you're trying to optimize those 7 quadruples. The way we set the Gaussian process is basically with a square exponential kernel, where you have some hyperparameters. Like Kyle mentioned some of that this morning. Like, for example, some of the hyperparameters that we select is, for example, this L here. This L here, for example, is what it means, for example, for the width and a specific place if I change one of the quadruples, like, for example, quadruple 1. If I set that setting at a value of 5 amps, how much do I know if I'm at 5.1 amps for that width? So that's this setting. Like, for example, this one. Some of the magnets have hysteresis. So it depends how you go to a particular setting in the magnet, if you go from up in the current or down in the current. So that's the noise that is introduced in the system. So you can set those parameters first. The acquisition function that we selected is this LCD, that is an interplay between exploration and exploitation. What you are trying to minimize things, like, for example, the width. If you want to minimize that, you have a mean that is when you're doing the Gaussian process, you want to minimize this part. But at the same time, you want to explore areas where you have a large variance, where you don't know anything. This parameter psi is the exploration parameter. And you can select those in the code. Okay, you can play with these different parameters to see if you get different results. Now, this, for example, is a toy example where, for example, here if you change 2 of the settings of the magnets, how it changes for the beam width at focal plane 1. And you see here, like, for example, you want to get a light color. How you change the function of the step, how this fitting of this beam width changes a function of Q1 and Q2. Okay? Now, what the code is really doing is something like this, where you have, for example, Q1 and Q2. This is the mean. In this case, will be the width at focal plane 1. This is the variance, how well you know as a function of Q1 and Q2 after you fit after these many points. And this is the next point that the system tells you to check. So here the different dots correspond to how early in the optimization, in the Gaussian process, the point was taken, the iteration. Light means that it was early on, black means later. Like, for example, here, the next point would be, like, for example, places where you have a large variance, because that means that these areas in the phase space, in this case of Q1 and Q2, where you have very little information of what is happening. Like, for example, here. You see here, like, for example, you don't have a lot of information. But it turns out, like, for example, in this case, the next acquisition function tells you that the next place that you have to explore is this one, that is somewhere over here. So in this case, is where you have a low mean, a low width, and in this case, the algorithm is preferring to have exploitation instead of exploration of areas where you don't have enough information. The other thing that I want to mention before you go into the exercise is that this is a multi-objective exercise in the sense that you want to optimize different objectives at the same time. And this is something that we do in SECAR the whole time. Like, for example, here I was talking about the width at focal plane 1, where the chart selection is. But I also mentioned that we also want to get a nice resolution where the mass selection is. So in this case, you may have to have, like, for example, two objectives, the chart selection being width, the width, you want to minimize this one, but you also want to obtain a relatively large mass separation. So if you plot the inverse of this, you want to be over here. You want to be very, very low in this corner over here. The thing is that this is a function of Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, all of those settings for those magnets. So how do you select that? And sometimes those objectives are not one-to-one. They compete against each other. And from an experimental point of view, you want to get something that we call the Pareto front. Let me start this. I think this is a movie. So for example, here, this is the Pareto front. In this case, let me stop this for a second. So if a member, this is basically different combinations of Q1. For every data point here is a specific combination of magnet settings that gives you for every magnet, at that specific combination of magnet settings, you have a given mass separation and a given width, okay? The Pareto point in this case is that every member here is better than everything else that is on this area. But like, for example, this one is not better than this one. This one is not better than this one because it is better in terms of charge of beam width because it's lower, but it's worse because this one is better in mass separation. Okay? At the end of the day, what we want is actually to find a Pareto front. And we want to find a Pareto front because now we as an experimentalist, then we can select the optics that we actually want in a given experiment. In some experiments, we want to have a very high separation. In some experiments, we want to have a very small beam width. So it's a choice at the end of the day. The other thing that you can do with this, and this is if you feel brave enough to do this for this exercise, is that if you find a Pareto front that has a lot of members, for example, here, you can try to do dimension reduction in our system. In this particular case, we only have 7 dimensions. These are the 7 dipoles, the 7 quadrupoles. But if you find good members, for example, all of these ones seem to be the Pareto front at the end. If you do dimension reduction here, you can try to do you can try to reduce these to main. You know that these are the good optics. So you may want to reduce, instead of like tuning the 7 quadruples one by one, you may want to reduce these to just 2 dimensions. And from an experimental point of view, that's actually much better because you only have to tune 2 knobs instead of 7 knobs at the same time. Okay, I think that's everything I have. You have to say anything, Rahul?
Oh, no, just in the exercise, you will have like a separate SECAR.py file, which emulates sort of the like light accelerator in a way. And the actual working notebook, that's IPython like Jupyter notebook, actually calls functions from the SECAR, but you shouldn't have to touch the SECAR .py file at all. So this is actually the data that the accelerator will output in real time, but all the analysis that you have to do is within the Jupyter. And there are instructions in there. If you get stuck, we are around, so just go.
Okay.